Alright, how the camera works, part 2. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Let's get into some of these nitty-gritties about how this thing works, how this thing's work, and digital noise. What's up with that? We'll find out. Alright, the exposure triangle. Let's crack into it. So first thing first, what you're going to want to set for your exposure basis is the ISO, the International Standards Organization. Used to be known as ASA as well, the American Standardization Association. Doesn't matter. What it means is the sensitivity to light, either your sensor sensitivity or in film, we're talking film sensitivity to light. But ISO is the base number to start off for our exposure. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive to light the sensor is going to be, so it needs more of an exposure, more light, and then the higher the number, the more sensitive to light it is. The trade-off on these though is the lower the number, you have a much tighter grain structure. There's no real noise. Images are sharper, but again, you need more light. So you have slower shutter speeds, or your f-stop is more wide open, depending on your lighting situation. And then the higher you go on the ISO, it needs less light, so you can get away with some handheld low lit situations, but you're going to get some noise. So step one in understanding your camera, find out how to change that ISO on the fly. Take it off auto, you don't want that. On this diagram here, that photo on the left is the back of a Nikon camera, and so there's a quick button. Canon has these too, Pentax, whatever you're shooting with, there's always going to be a quick button, or you get into the menu and do it that way, and that's what's on the right hand side, is it's inside the camera's menu. But first you're going to start off with finding out how to change that ISO. So what does ISO do? I just mentioned sensitivity to light, talked about some grain structure. So grain, when we talk about grain, again, it's a holdover from the film days, and grain is actually what film was made up of. And we're talking digital code, and the higher our ISO goes, we get more of what's called noise. And you can see in this photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge that on the far right hand side, the ISO is set to 3200. So that's really fast. And when we say fast, that means it's more sensitive to light, so exposures happen faster. So it's a fast ISO. But look at the overall image quality. You see the pixels, you see that noise, you see square. So it becomes part of the image. So when you're in a low light situation, you don't have a tripod, you need to be aware that that's going to be part of the photo. If you scan all the way to the left and you see it set at ISO 100, really low, really slow ISO, it needs more light, so exposures happen longer, you can see that the image is really crisp. There's no noise, but it was a long exposure. Take a look at the water and take a look at the sky. You can see a sense of movement. So again, this is the first basis of our exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is made up of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And we set the ISO first, typically based on what the lighting situation is like. But these are things you need to be aware of to start off with. So the lower the ISO setting needs more light, less noise, or no noise. Then the higher the ISO, the more noise you will get, but the less light you need to make an exposure. So here's an example of a photograph shot at ISO 100, and what you can see is it's really sharp. There's no noise. It's a really bright day, so that low ISO allowed for this exposure because there's a lot of light. It's a really bright sunny day, and you can see it's very, very sharp. There's lots of detail in the entire photo, as opposed to this image, which is shot at 3200. So a really fast ISO and really low light. It's interior. We can see it's interior. We can even assume that this is probably at night due to the light quality. And it looks like this is a doorway, and it looks really dark. So this is a really low light situation, but it allowed for some stop motion, this horse and rider. But it's really noisy, and it's a little bit blurry. It's not necessarily as sharp. but the photographer was lucky enough to get a handheld image because of this high ISO. If we compare the two together, we just cropped in on some of these subjects. You see on the left hand side in the ISO 100, the horse's eye is really sharp. There's lots of detail. You can count all the hairs. Then on the right hand side, the details of the horse and rider are a bit more blurry. There's a lot of noise. There's lots of pixels. There's grain happening. It's not as sharp. So again, these are just examples of two things that you need to be aware of when you're setting that ISO. Now, the best thing about this in the digital world is we can change at a moment's notice. You know, we don't have to rewind film. We don't have to replace cartridges. We can go from ISO 100, then go into a dark place, and then immediately change it to ISO 3200. But you need to be aware of it, because if you leave it at 3200 and then go outside in the really bright light, it's definitely going to be a photograph that's not as sharp as that ISO 100. But this is a beautiful thing of digital, is this ability to change ISOs at a moment's notice. Now, one thing to point out, especially on our mirrorless cameras, some of the older ones, they have something that's called ISO expansion. And what this does, it expands the inherent ISO of the camera. So your cameras are all going to have an embedded, range, and it's somewhere between 100 to 3200, maybe 50 to 6400. That's a pretty big range. But if you turn on ISO expansion, you can get a stop or two in either direction, or so you think. What it actually does is it overexposes, and when that happens, a lot of times on these mirrorless cameras, some of these older ones, it actually ends up clipping out the color channels. So in this photograph of this surfer walking along the rock ridge here, the ISO expansion was on, and the photographer thought that they were getting a much slower ISO than what they were actually getting, bright day on the beach. And what ended up happening is they cut out the blue channel entirely. So the sky went pink. And this was an issue to definitely be aware of. Obviously, no pink skies. That's not natural. It doesn't look good. So the rule is just leave the ISO inherent to what it is. Don't turn the expansion on. Work within your means. And then another way around this is to turn it black and white. But shh, don't worry about that. All right. So the aperture controls depth of field. And remember when I talked about the camera and the lens works a lot like your eye. The lens of your camera, definitely think about that as your eye. So look at this diagram. You can see when there's a low light, not a lot of light available, your pupil opens up really big to let in as much light as possible. And essentially that's what our lens does too, the aperture. We open up that ring wide open, it's going to let in a lot of light. Now, when there is a lot of light available, our eyes do the opposite. Our pupil gets really small to let in as little light, to refine that light so we can see better. And our lens has that option too. We can close down, we can stop down that aperture ring, and that's going to increase our depth of field. So depth of field, again, is what's in focus from foreground to background and everything in between. And when we have a small aperture, letting in as little light as possible, that gives us an increased, greater depth of field. And when our aperture is wide open, we have a shallow depth of field. That means not a lot is in focus. So here's the lens from our DSLR. And that's, again, one of the great things about these cameras is being able to change our lens. And at the back of the lens is our aperture ring. That's the actual ring. If you notice, if you look on your lens, there's these numbers. These are our f-stops. But if you look through that lens, as we turn that aperture ring, you can see more or less light is allowed in depending on where that is, just like the pupil of your eye. All right, so this is where it gets a little confusing as far as the aperture is concerned and depth of field, because it's got two names. It's got aperture and then it's got f-stops, and you hear me refer to both of those when I'm referring to the same aspect of photography. And the aperture is the literal ring, that actual ring that we moved, that you saw move, and then those numbers on it are our f-stops. Now, some of your newer cameras, or I should say your newer lenses, won't have that aperture ring that you can physically move because everything's happening internal. We're moving dials on the camera, and we'll get to that. But the specifics are the same. The aperture is still that physical ring, and the f-stops are those actual numbers. So the f-stop is a ratio of the lens focal length in regards to the diameter of the entrance of the pupil. So you can think of apertures and f-stops as fractions. So a f2 is equivalent to 1/2, and an f16 is not just a fighter pilot. Wait, it's not a fighter pilot. The fighter pilot's the person. Scratch that joke, I messed it up. So f16 is not just an aperture, but it's 1/16. So when you think about them in relation to each other, size-wise, f2 is going to be bigger. It's going to let in more light than f16 because fractionally a half is larger than 1/16. So f16 is a small hole. They're also called stops. Now literally f-stop, stop is in the word, but the difference between each placement is called a stop. And this isn't just for the aperture and f-stops, it's also for your ISO. The difference between one ISO to the next is one stop. So ISO 100, when you go to ISO 200 is one stop. From ISO 200 to ISO 400 is another stop. When we're talking about on the aperture ring, f-stop 2.8 going from 2.8 to f4 is one stop. And then from f4 to 5.6 is also one stop. And the easiest way to think about these in relation to each other, these full stops, is they all work in double and half. So our digital cameras are really fancy, and we have third stops, half stops, we may even have quarter stops. But what we see listed here is a range of full stops. And as far as full stops go, when you go from one to the other, you're either letting in half as much or twice as much light. So if I'm at f2.8, I'm wide open, I'm letting in lots of light. And if I stop down to f4, when I say stop down, I'm letting in less light. So when I go from 2.8 to f4, I'm actually letting in half as much light. And then when I go from f4 to f5.6, I'm stopping down again, and I'm letting in half as much light. And then continue that on, 5.6 to f8. F8 is half as much light as 5.6. And then the reciprocal of that is when you go the opposite direction, when you open up. So when you open up on the f-stop, you're letting in light. So if I open up from f8 to 5.6, I'm actually letting in twice as much light. And then when I go from 5.6 to f4, I'm letting in twice as much light as well. And that's the only math you're really going to need to know for now, is double and half. And here's a breakdown of an illustration of what a prime fixed focal length lens will look like. Now we talked about lenses, but to talk about this real quick, we talked about focal length and telephoto and zoom lenses, but a fixed focal length lens is also known as a prime lens, and this means it's only one focal length. It's only a 50mm lens, or it's only a 24mm. And what's great about these lenses is you can really make use of what's called the depth of field scale. And what this is it shows you the distance of how much is going to be in focus depending on what f-stop you're on. So in this illustration, we can see here's our aperture and our f-stops, and then above that we see the scale. And then we see a distance scale, just like you would when you're measuring. So this depth of field scale measures out from the smallest f-stop to the largest f-stop on either side. And then as you change your focus, your actual focal ring on the end of the lens, this distance scale is going to move as well. And where these distances line up with your f-stops, it shows you from where to where what will be in focus. So in this particular model, we are on f16, and according to our depth of field and distance scale, the distance scale stopped on the depth of field scale with 15 feet on f16 and 30 feet on f16. So what that means is everything between 15 to 30 feet away from the photographer will be in focus. That will be the depth of field. This works much easier on these prime lenses. On your zoom lenses, it doesn't work so well. It's not as trustworthy, or it's not even there. But on your prime lenses, this is a really advantageous thing to use. Speaking of, if you want to really make use of focusing on infinity, this increases your depth of field by utilizing the scale. So if you put that infinity sign, if you stop all the way down to f22 on this particular lens, and then put the infinity sign on that f22 from focusing, you can see how using the distance scale, everything from just over 20 feet to infinity will be in focus, as opposed to putting that infinity sign in the center of focusing. Everything from 50 to infinity, everything from 50 feet, I should say, to infinity will be in focus. So essentially, using this depth of field scale, you gained 30 feet of focus. That's pretty huge, especially if you're working with landscape. So this is just a little trick, something to keep in mind, kind of tell you how our depth of field will work. Now, let me back up one real quick. Now, our aperture and our f-stop control depth of field as well, meaning how much is going to be in focus. And I mentioned the smaller the f-stop, the less is going to be in focus, the more shallow. And then the larger the f-stop, it's actually the smaller the hole, but the greater your depth of field will be. So we can see that here at f16, everything from 15 to 30 will be in focus. But if we were to open up to f4, and again, opening up means letting in more light, we would then decrease our depth of field from about 18 feet to just over 20 would be what's in focus. All right, so let's see some more examples about depth of field and how a couple of things play a part in that. First, one thing we already mentioned last time was your actual sensor size. The larger the sensor, the greater your depth of field will be. The smaller the sensor, the less depth of field you can get. And the main thing that we use to control is the aperture, what f-stop we use. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see two examples of these two different photos of these sculptural ballerinas. And in the top left, you see one that's really shallow depth of field, meaning there's not a whole lot in focus. Just that center ballerina is in focus at f2, standard 50mm lens, 2 feet away. So the photographer stopped down all the way to f22. Again, stopping down means letting in less light. They went all the way down to f22, really, really small opening on that aperture ring, increasing that depth of field. It becomes really deep meaning a lot in focus. We can see that all three of those ballerinas are in focus now. So shallow and deep is one way that we talk about our depth of field, our focus range. It's like a swimming pool. The shallow end has less water, and then the deep end has more water. So shallow is a small f-stop with a large opening. Deep is a small opening with a large f-stop. The smaller the opening, deeper the depth of field. The bigger the opening, the more shallow your depth of field. So that's one aspect of depth of field. Then another aspect is your physical proximity to your subjects. The closer you are to whatever you are focusing on, the more shallow your depth of field is going to be. And again, it works just like your eyeballs. Think about if you put something in front of your face and you look at that and focus on that, the background's going to go blurry. But if you back up, then more things come in focus to you as well. Again, your camera works the same way. So in this example, in this illustration, in the upper right-hand corner, we see this tow zone sign, no stopping, and hanging on a fence. And in the first photo on the left, where it's more filling the frame, the sign and the fence are in focus, and the building in the background are blurry. Then the photographer physically backs up about 15 more feet, still focusing on the sign, still the same f-stop. These are both at f8, which is a moderate depth of field, or moderate, I should say, f-stop. It's not really shallow, it's not really deep, but at 20 feet away, they now can have the building also in focus. So distance to subject plays a major factor in your depth of field. The further away you get from something, the deeper your focus, your depth of field will be. So here's just an example of using simply just your f-stop again. From wide open, really shallow depth of field at f2.8, that center coin is in focus. The foreground and background are really blurry. The center one here shows f11, which is a good moderate depth of field. Still the same focal point. It's still focused on the quarter in the center. The other ones begin to be more in focus, but that foreground and that background are still blurry. And then all the way stop down, super deep, f32, the whole thing is in focus. All the quarters and whatever they are on, floor or table, foreground, background, all completely sharp. One more thing, the fourth thing that plays a factor in your depth of field is your actual focal length, so what lens you have on your camera. I mentioned before your telephoto lenses compress spaces and make things look closer, but it also gives you a more shallow depth of field and due to that compression rate. So we see in this photo on the left with a 200mm lens at 10 feet away with an f8 on the lens, just the one branch with the flowers are in focus. Anything behind it's completely blurry. Then the photographer stayed at the same settings and the same distance, still at f8, 10 feet away, but they switched to a 24mm lens, so a wide angle lens. And your wide angle lenses give you more depth of field. And we can see in the photo that now not just that one branch, but in fact the whole tree canopy and the branches are all sharp. And that's simply just because of the lenses. So the four things that affect depth of field are sensor sizes, your f-stop, whatever your aperture is set at, your distance to the subject, and then your focal length. So here's an example of a photographer who is considered like the grandfather here, or modern day grandfather of landscape photography. Now, landscape photography started in the 1800s, well before Ansel Adams, but he's the big name in the 20th century. And his main concern was depth of field. Well, he had a lot of main concerns, but as far as we're concerned with this lecture was depth of field, meaning everything is in focus. Super deep depth of field. He's shooting on a large format camera, 8x10, and he could get down to f64. So really, really small, really big, deep depth of field. And we can see here in this photograph in Yosemite that the foreground here is sharp. All the way along the bank of the river, all the trees, and all the way back to the mountain, sharp. All because of that f64. Same thing here in New Mexico. These striations here in the foreground, in the shadows, really sharp. The river, oxbow around to the backgrounds in the clouds, all tack sharp. And it's because of that f64. This is deep depth of field. This is how you can use the lens and the settings to your advantage for a certain purpose. Now, he wanted to show the glory of nature, wanted everything to be sharp so you can see everything at once. Sharp here, these rocks in the foreground, trees and mountain range and clouds also in the background are all tack sharp. That's all deep depth of field, all thanks to the lens and the large format and, some other tricks. So these are good examples of why you would use deep depth of field and how you would do it. Stop your lens all the way down, create a really small opening, let as little light as possible in, gives you that really deep depth of field so you can see every little aspect of the image. So the opposite of that is a shallow depth of field, right? So not a whole lot in focus. Gives you a little bit more interpretation. You get to play a little bit more with lighting, a little bit more with form and shape, and overall composition. So Mona Kuhn is a contemporary artist, and this specific body of work all deals with this shallow depth of field approach. And Mona's originally from Brazil, and in this this body of work, she was in France, where they're a little bit more open with their bodies, a little bit more, I guess, not as controlling as they are in the States. And this is a place where a lot of people hung out just in their natural skin. And Mona used the simple aspect of shallow depth of field, shooting with her lens wide open, to recontextualize the body. So it's not salacious, it's not titillating, it's more impressionistic, which of course is a very French thing, but using that technique in photography to make portraits of people without clothes and not to really focus on the nude and more alluding to it. So in this foreground, yes, this is a close-up portrait of a woman. We see bare shoulders. We don't see any other aspects of her nude body. And in the background, we see blurry and out of focus that there's another human body back there. And it's assumed that they are nude, but we can't really tell. It's not sharp, it's not in focus. And this is because of the f-stop, shooting wide open on her lens. Same thing on this one, where here on the far right, again, alluded to the nude body. We see the bare shoulders, the bare almost side of the breast, the side of the hip, and we see this hand holding a glass. No real, nudity. But in the background, we see three people sitting around or standing around a table. And though this one person assumed to be a gentleman sitting at the table, maybe wearing a towel, blanket, or shorts, not really sure, I can't tell, it's not sharp because of the depth of field, the background alludes that there are some nude people. And it's not that she's hiding the nude, it's just, it's a different approach, different way to contextualize. And it's something simple, just coming down to the f-stop. Same with this gentleman shot through, a window and a door, where the focus is on the door frame and not the person. But again, it gives you this illusion, this idea of the body in the background. Same on this woman sitting on a bed in front of windows, focuses on very early in the foreground on the door, alluding, we get the idea, but it's definitely not Ansel Adams. If Ansel took this photo, everything would be sharp. We would look through that window. We would see the trees. We would see the person on the body. The person's body sitting on the bed. But Mona, gives us a little bit more contextualized, a little bit more narrative forced through this shallow depth of field. So when you are focusing and utilizing shallow depth of field, where you set that focal point plays a major impact. We saw some, undulation in Mona's photos. So here's just some examples, some real-world examples of how it'll affect your photo. So it still gives us a sense of space. It still gives you a sense of texture. It's a good way to play around with the formalist approach in image making. But you can see in this photo where the depth of field at 2.8 is set on the foreground compared to this image where it's the same place, same composition, but that focal point is in the dead center. The two photos play different with our mind as far as what is our actual focus. And then comparative to f22, deep depth of field. Now the whole side here, these rocks, these graffitied rocks are now in focus. There's a different feeling, there's a different emotion. Same with this. So when you have backgrounds that compete with your foregrounds, pay attention to how the two compete for attention. So in this photo, shallow depth of field, aperture is set at f2.8, really shallow, focused on that sign. And then the background is the background, its shape, its form, its line, but it doesn't overwhelm us compared to this one now where the f-stop is set at f22. So now everything is in focus. So now that those shapes and textures in the background, now that they're in focus, they're competing for our attention over the sign. So it comes down to your intent. What do you want the actual focus to be for the viewer's attention? So here's some real-world examples of depth of field and the lens and distance to subject and how it all plays together. So here we see the final image in the upper left-hand corner of these three gentlemen, standing in an alleyway, and the focal point is placed right on that center person, and yet they're in focus. Foreground gentleman is out of focus. Background gentleman is also out of focus. You can see the setup. You can see distance from photographer to subjects in the right-hand side. You see the illustration of the lens. And you can sure enough see that the lens is open, wide open at f2, and you can see there, check out our distance scale, and we see that the one gentleman is about 7 feet away from the photographer, and that's pretty much the apex of his depth of field. And then here's another example, same setup. We see the photographer, people have not moved. The lens, only thing that moved on that was the aperture. Was set now to f16, so a deep depth of field. And now look at that distance scale. It didn't move, the focal point didn't change, it's in the exact same spot. But now that depth of field increased to a total of 8 feet. So that now gets the foreground guy and the background guy in focus. Very similar to what we saw with those quarters on the table. So that's the f-stop aperture. The other thing that controls light, how much light gets into our camera, is the shutter, known as the shutter speed. And it's also in fractions. And they are recorded in fractions of a second. So all the shutter does is open and close. That's it. It doesn't control depth of field. It doesn't give you noise. It can give you blur depending on your shutter speed. It can stop motion. The faster that shutter speed is, the faster that fraction of a second is, the more you are likely to stop motion compared to a slower shutter speed where you'll get blur. So in this image we see, someone swinging on a swing, and at a shutter speed of 1/500th, they are stopped. They are crisp. They are floating in the air. In this other photo, the shutter speed was slowed down now to a 1/60th of a second. And a 1/60th of a second sounds pretty fast, but when you're dealing with moving objects, it was too slow. So the woman is blurry not because they weren't focused on, but because they were moving faster than the shutter. And then here we see they're just this ghost blur. This is it. Here's the trick. Here's how you do ghost photos. Slow shutter and moving. That's it. The person is completely gone. This shutter speed of 1/8 of a second is a really slow shutter speed. In fact, it's so slow that you can't handhold this without getting a little bit of blur. You typically don't want to go under a 1/60th of a second, or whatever the focal length is of your lens. So if you have a 200mm lens, you probably don't want to go under 1/250th of a second because of the weight, and physically hitting that shutter button moves your camera. So this photo was obviously taken on a tripod, but here we can see all of them together. We can see the motion and the blurring and the stop motion compared to their exposures. So again, the exposure triangle is your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And once you have the ISO set, you pretty much just balance these two. And as you can see, they gave us the camera settings on all of these, and it went from 1/500th at f2 to 1/60th at f5.6 to f8 at f16. And you can see when you move one, you move the other. And you also can see how the depth of field changes in this photo. So, general rule, whenever you move one, you are always going to move the other. So here's some shutter speed examples as well. So this is a really slow shutter speed of this waterfall at 1/10 of a second. And this water is really blurry. You see there's lots of motion to it because it's moving so fast that it's not captured, stopped motion because of the slow shutter speed. So if you wanted to stop the waterfall, you need a faster shutter speed, like this, 1/200th of a second. Now you can actually see these droplets of the water. Side-by-side comparison of another waterfall. You can see at 1/30th of a second, looking down, it's just this blur. There's no stop motion. But here at 1/250th, it's almost sculptural the way the water hits the edge of the waterfall. And it's because it's moving so fast, and then the shutter speed is so fast that it stops it in midair. Another side-by-side, 1/10th of a second compared to 1/500th of a second. Really fast, really blurry, and then here, stop motion. It's almost a comparison of a little more serene motion to an erratic stop motion. Here's a photograph that was shot at 1/1,000,000th of a second. This scientist created our studio strobes. So this was actually a studio strobe lit where the light emanated for 1/1,000,000th of a second to capture a milk droplet on a table. And that's how that crown was created. Here's another exciting explosion photo. Real fast shutter capturing these rocks stopped in midair. Another use of the shutter speed to stop this kind of action. Real fast shutter speed. Something to think about when something is moving. If you want to stop it, you have to get really high on that shutter speed. So the opposite of that is, incorporating blur. Just like we saw the difference of deep depth of field versus shallow depth of field with Ansel and Mona. John DeVola is a contemporary artist. He's been working for a number of years, and in this particular body of work, he was out in the desert. There were dogs chasing his car, so he started photographing dogs chasing his car in the desert. And so what this has is a sense of movement to them, a sense of blur, instead of just this crisp action. So some get real erratic, real blurry. So this is a much slower shutter speed, and the dog is moving, John is moving in the car sometimes, but it gives you a different feeling instead of just stopping. One interesting aspect that came into play is this photographic use, a technique called panning. And this combines a slow shutter speed with camera motion to create this sense of speed around a moving object. So the way this works is you focus on the moving subject, typically, running parallel to you, so it's a horizontal action, and you match their speed while looking through the camera, and then, press the shutter as they run by you. And as they run by you and you're holding the shutter, you move the camera with them. So here we see the focus on the dog, and he looks like I don't want to make a judgment call. The dog is moving. It looks like he's always moving fast because everything's blurry around them. Another good example of this is one of my favorite people, Usain Bolt, at Olympics a number of years ago. Pfeifenbach used that same technique where he focused on Usain, slow shutter, and it looks as though Usain is running so fast, it's just so blurry. And it's just that simple technique. It's just this panning technique where you focus on the moving object. This one is the fastest man alive ever. So awesome. And you see everything goes blurry. You see the background goes nice and blurry, and it's because of that movement, that camera shake kind of movement. Spencer did the same thing here with Usain. One of my favorite photos. I love that smile back. I love how frantic everyone looks like they're moving, and just that gorgeous smile on Usain. But still, that panning motion really shows that sense of speed. It heightens that sense of speed, and it's done with a slower shutter, 15th or a 10th or something, and then you move along with the subject. So to stop Usain, I had to go back and get some studio strobes and fast shutter speed, burst of light, this beautiful photo by Levon Bliss. Stop motion. That's how you stop Usain Bolt. So here's just a little balance chart between the two of shutter speed and aperture. Shows you, faster shutter speed gives you less light, less chance of motion blur. A larger aperture gives you more light, less depth of field. A slower shutter speed lets in more light, but it gives you more chance of blurring. And a smaller aperture lets in less light and gives you a greater depth of field. And then here's the 3. So this diagram shows you the different effects due to the different types of the 3 things that make up your exposure triangle. ISO on the bottom, you can see when it goes from sharp to more noisy. Your shutter speed in the center, where it goes from stop motion to more blur. And then your f-stop aperture, where it goes from deep depth of field to more shallow. This is a good one to keep on hand, so you can always reference, what is the actual effect from each of the different aspects of that triangle. Alright, so there it is. ISO, shutter speed, aperture, explained pretty much in detail of what each does and how it affects your photos. Now to change them in camera, again, you're going to press your shutters button here halfway to wake it up, and then there's either a dial on the front, perhaps there's a dial on the back, depending on your camera. As you look through your viewfinder, when you are in the manual mode, that's the big M, as you turn these, you will see them change. And then again, you'll pay attention to your light meter, and when they're in sync, that's when you'll take a photo. What's the light meter? Well, let's get into that next. Here on digital photography. That's cold too. That's good.